This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Today, we are very happy to be joined by Arthur Herman to talk about the incredible story of the Vikings. Now, the Vikings aren't just fearsome warriors from the north that ravaged the countryside in Dark Ages Europe. Far from it. The Viking spirit carries on into the Scandinavian people and their diaspora all over the course of centuries. Professor Arthur Herman is the author of numerous books, including How the Scots Invented the Modern World. Professor Herman, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you got interested in the history of the Scandinavians?
Sure. And I should say I'm not a professor anymore. After How the Scots Invented the Modern World, I ended my academic career in order to write books. And then in 2014, I came to Washington think tank, Hudson Institute, as a senior fellow to work on various policy programs and things of that sort. So I accept the honor of being Professor Herman, but Dr. Herman will do the trick just as well. So how did I get started in this book? Well, I'll tell you, it really actually dates back to when I had finished How the Scots Invented the Modern World, the book you just mentioned, that New York Times bestseller and had all kinds of nominations for historical prizes. And so my uncle Norman, said to me, so when are you going to write a book on the Vikings? Now, he asked me that because Uncle Norman's parents, like my mother's parents, had come over from Norway just before World War I. And so it was a question that was clearly much on his mind, about Scandinavians and Viking roots. But it was also one that planted a seed in my head that basically took about 20 years to finally shake out with a published work, which is this one. And I guess part of my interest in all this, to be honest, Stephen, is that what I came to realize is that the story about the Vikings isn't just about medieval history or about, longships filled with raiders and pillagers attacking the coast of Europe and eventually reaching across the Atlantic to North America. It's also about a cultural skill set that developed because of the ecosystem in which the Scandinavian tribes who became Vikings lived in and endured and survived in, that gave them a skill set which they carried to the rest of Europe, which their descendants then employed in order to become major rulers and even empire builders in the Middle Ages, and which also became part of the cultural property of Scandinavians who came to this country, came to America in the 19th century, including family members on both sides of my ancestry, both my father's side and also my mother's side. But which also, and it's an important point, Stephen, is also part of the cultural legacy of modern Scandinavia, and that really links the people who you meet when you travel in Norway and Sweden, Denmark and Finland and Iceland, that links them to those fearsome forebears during the Viking Age.
Maybe to start off the conversation, a good way is to set the stage a little bit of who these people are. Where did you set the modern geographic boundaries? Where did they come from, the Scandinavians, even going back as far as the Bronze Age, and just to get us a little bit of idea of who they are?
Or even before that, if you like, at the end of the Ice Age, when the big ice caps that would have covered modern Scandinavia, and particularly those four countries, receded, and bands of intrepid nomadic hunters moved up into these areas to hunt, to fish, and eventually to clear land. And what's interesting, Stephen, about it is that those original inhabitants, what we can really call the indigenous peoples who moved into this area in the aftermath of the Ice Age, pretty much the same inhabitants down to today. It's not a case, unlike virtually every other part of the world that you can think of, in which eventually foreign interlopers or invaders or migrants come and either take over or intermingle with the population. And the reason's obvious, and that is that no one in their right mind would want to live there. It's absolutely freezing cold. You have long winters. You have the whole issue of midnight sun in summer, but also perpetual darkness in winter. The resources are meager. The landscape is inhospitable. There's very little land for growing food. And if you decide to make your livelihood from the sea by fishing, those are very dangerous and treacherous waters that surround that whole area. So the people who live there, people who stick it out through the millennia, are a very tough and hardy breed. They are people who learn very early on that the only survival in that kind of environment is going to be group survival, that you have to work with family, with community, with kinship groups, the tribe, the fundamental social unit being the tribe, all the way through the Viking Age. You have to work together, cooperate together in order to make that environment livable and sustainable. And again, that becomes a cultural trait that leaves its stamp on Scandinavians and on Scandinavian society from the Viking Age and from the pre-Viking Age all the way down through the century.
I guess one of the things, the hallmarks of the Scandinavian cultures and the later Vikings is this wanderlust of a people on the move. They interacted with just about every single culture in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And I'm just wondering, could we place a couple of the key factors? You mentioned some, but to sum it up, what are some of the ideas of why this particular group was so widespread so early?
It's a great question, Stephen. And one of the things that I emphasize in my book is that what the cultural trait I just described, the need for group survival and everyone cooperating, working together, that solidarity of the family, the clan, the tribe, was also offset by another character. And that is, because Scandinavian was so poor, because resources are so scarce, is that there's a incentive to have members of the tribe, of the community, to encourage them to set out to look for opportunities to bring in for the tribe's benefit what the landscape and the environment won't support. And so the idea of setting out by ship, almost always by ship, because Scandinavia is surrounded by water, the idea of setting out by ship and by boat to look to the horizon and see what lies there that you can bring back to benefit everyone, that becomes a characteristic of even before the Viking Age. We know that these intrepid sea travelers went deep into Europe, went around the coast of Europe, looking for trade opportunities and looking for places in which to export the commodities that they did have, furs, let's say, ivory, the honey and amber, which was an important early commodity for Bronze Age Scandinavia, in exchange for goods. When things turn ugly for others is when, by the 8th century of the Christian era, when those intrepid travelers and sea-going merchants and adventurers began to realize that this other parts of Europe, much more developed parts of Europe, with much richer economies, are actually unable to defend themselves from those who are willing to take rather than trade. And so the Viking Age is born. The opportunity to steal, the opportunity to raid and pillage is there, and they take full advantage of it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You said that they were bringing in, and you can bring in through trade, but you can also bring in through pillage and taking. Now,
exactly. It's like, look what I just found. In Ireland, writing the coast of Ireland or the coast of Scotland. That's exactly what happened.
This name Viking gets thrown around, and I think it's important to really define what is a Viking. It doesn't really describe a people as such. It's more of a job title, maybe.
It is. It's a job. It's an occupation, or even it's a phase of life that one engages in when you are ready to undertake the enterprises that constitutes going Viking. The word, we think, Stephen, I talk about this in the book, the word we think comes from the Old Norse word for, or even Proto-Norse word of Vik, which means a creek, right? In other words, it has to do with water, with in a sense, with being involved in some way with waterways and water courses, including from rivers into and fjords into the sea. And so going Viking comes to mean embarking on piratical expeditions on other peoples, but it's also important on other Scandinavians. I mean, the solidarity that I'm describing is precisely those who are located in a specific and geographic location, eventually a specific linguistic as ethnic group. And so just as boatloads of Danes and Norwegians, as I describe them in the book and talk about those classic Viking raids, like the raids on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 on the English coast, which is usually dated as being the beginning of the classic Viking Age. In addition to raids on them, you've got Danes raiding Swedes, you've got Norwegians raiding Danish villages. Vikings are spend as much time fighting among each other as they do attacking foreigners.
Would they, in the height of the Viking Age in the 9th century, would they have ever applied that term as an identity, I'm a Viking, or was it always used in a sort of a verb, we're going Viking?
It is used as a term to describe those are Vikings. In other words, those are a band of pillagers who are setting out. It's often used derogatorily too in the Norse sagas. So-and-so's a Viking. You better stand clear. You better steer clear of him if he's going to be up to that. But by and large, that's not the way in which talk about themselves, except in this sort of active way of being people who are engaged in voyages to the outside, whether raiding your neighbors or raiding outsiders. Instead, they think of themselves as part of a distinct community for whom the overriding priority is simply survival, and then ultimately in finding ways in which to benefit from the goods and commodities provided by the more developed civilizations around them, not just Europe, but as you just pointed out, also Islam and also the Greek Byzantine Empire as well. Those are the magnets that draw the Vikings' attention for more than 200 years. And if they can't get it by through trade, they'll get it by violence.
These people who were leaving Scandinavia, would they have, I'm sure it changes from group to group and from time to time, and it probably gets as specific as you could ever imagine, but in general, when they were leaving, was it their intention to trade, to pillage, to settle? Was there a general feeling where most of the people were leaving expecting, I'm going to go make a little wealth and then come back home? Or
I think you just hit it. I think and most of the expeditions that you see of the classic Viking Age, everybody comes home, or they maintain their ties there. They may go there to settle because it's for one thing, the land is better. It's very, it's irresistible. The draw of large acres, relatively large acres, compared to what the landscape in Norway or Sweden or even Denmark, which is probably the most agriculturally diverse of the three Scandinavian Nordic countries. But yeah, by and large, going Viking is a part-time activity. It's something that you do and we know this from the Norse sagas. I have a description of the stories from Egil's saga, for example, which is a pretty good portrait of what life is like for sort of, we'll call it ordinary Viking, right? And that is spring comes, things thaw, and this is a good time to refit your longship, get family and friends together, and set out on a Viking voyage. And you might bring some goods that you want to trade, or you may decide that it's just as good ransacking a village or hijacking a ship at sea and emptying out its cargo. And in fact, in Egil's saga, when he and his sons set out, one of the ships that they hijacked just happens to belong to their king. They don't, this is, whatever. We'll take the shot. We'll take a shot at it. It's got stuff we want. There's goods on that we want, and we'll take it. Or we'll do trade. The distinction, I don't think, was a very sharply drawn one in the minds of these farmers, and that's really what they were. This is a springtime activity, and then you come back and you resume your normal occupation with farming, animal husbandry, fishing, all the kinds of things that Europeans are doing all through the Middle Ages. It's not much difference except for this impulse to go out, push out, and see and use your seagoing technology to get what you need by any means necessary.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it leads into some of the other questions I had. I think I flip-flopped through reading this book, and I wrote two separate outlines about the modern Scandinavians and the medieval Scandinavians, and I had to pick one. I think I have to go with the medieval Scandinavians because it's such an interesting story, but I would maybe at some later time, if you ever have time, we could talk about the moderns, because that's another story in and of itself.
It is. And yet, I'll tell you, just a quick preview on that. If you travel in Scandinavia, or have a friend who's Swedish or Norwegian and Danish, and then you read the stories or watch the television shows about Vikings, and you say, really? This is the same people? They come from the same? And yet, one of the points of my book is there is a cultural continuity that exists there. Yes, they don't go around pillaging their neighbors. Christianity and the coming of the Reformation, as I describe in the book, had a big impact on changing and smoothing out the edges on the part of those peoples living in those lands. But the same underlying cultural base that we have to work together in order to survive together, that we have a mutual trust built on experience and working together in that way, but that individuals need to be free to look for their own path in ways that will benefit the whole. And also, too, that hard work is the warp and woof that makes for a happy society and a happy people. I don't think most people who talk to who know Scandinavia or have Scandinavian friends will disagree that that's part of their worldview, even to this day.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, I think that's interesting, is that when you read them, it helps you make more sense of the Vikings, that there is not a dichotomy between individuality and collective work, that you can do both of them.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And that's one of the things I wanted to bring out in my book, Stephen, is this degree to which the two are not exclusive, but it was always understood, even in the Viking age, even in the pre-Christian age, that if you go out on a voyage, you go out on expeditions, you're not just doing this to yourself. You're not just enriching yourself. You're enriching the community. You're enriching the tribe, because we all share a common destiny and a common fortune. If you can help us by, venturing out to into the unknown and bringing back what you find there, great. Then, by all means, set out. But the ties that bind are still powerful, that connect you to your community and to your home and to the old. And that's something that happens with Scandinavian American immigrants when they come to America. They don't lose their ties. They don't shed the connections there. My Norwegian grandmother, she stayed in contact with her brothers and her family. And after she died, my mother picked up those threads and remained connected to them too. The new country and the old country, remain connected in this really sort of powerful way, which is, it's not unique. It's not unique, but it's definitely an interesting characteristic of what it is that makes the Scandinavian American immigration so interesting.
One of the Vikings, I think, focusing in on one of the fan favorites, the interaction between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings.
Right.
I always tried to wrap my mind around, was the Vikings attacks a gigantic shock to the Anglo-Saxons, as we're commonly see if we read some of the first-hand accounts, because the Vikings kind of spoke a similar language. They had a similar culture. I mean, they weren't exactly the same, but they were similar. And I have to imagine that there was trade links because these places weren't that far away from each other. How big of a cultural shock really was it, and what's maybe some of the more modern scholarship and thought on that?
Well, that's a very good question. And of course, when looking at it from the perspective of the Anglo-Saxons, when they find themselves being made prey by raiders primarily from Denmark, primarily coming out of Denmark, but also some from Norway, I think the irony was lost on them that they had done the same damn thing. Yeah. The Britons when they arrived, And as I explain in the book, they came from the same part of the world, southern Scandinavia. The Angles tribes and then the Saxons are all part of that original community in southern Scandinavia, some of whom swung south, right, into the Germanic tribes who descend down into modern day Germany, but also France and Switzerland, and even down into northern Italy as well as into Eastern Europe. But others slipped across the North Sea and besieged Britain, and basically either wiped out or completely obliterated the indigenous Britain Celtic population there and took over. So in a way, you could argue that the Vikings, it's an internecine warfare, right, between cousins in a way, the Angles and the Saxons being Scandinavian descendants, and then the Vikings being the current Scandinavian inhabitants. That's also one of the reasons that in terms of DNA research, and I talk a lot in the book about how modern DNA research tells us a lot about where the Vikings went, where they settled, and about their interactions with other peoples in the lands that they conquered or interfaced with. That makes it difficult to distinguish between the DNA traces that are characteristic of Anglo-Saxon descent versus those of Scandinavian descent, specifically Danish, because they're so close, because they're so closely related. We don't have that problem when distinguishing Viking DNA, let's call it, from, let's say, Irish DNA. The differences, the strands are much easier to distinguish. But it makes it hard for our DNA scientists to find the difference there. All the same, and now this is a long answer to your question. All the same, it was a real shock when suddenly these Viking raiders, and the reason is not just because it certainly doesn't because the Anglo-Saxons themselves were so pacific. They fight among each other all the time. There's wars constantly among the five kingdoms that make up modern day England, not to mention between Anglo-Saxon and Scots, Anglo-Saxon and Picts, to the north, and the Welsh. Forget it. It's constant warfare. But what made it such a shock was the way in which the Vikings. This is one of the main points I make in the Viking Heart, that they bring a new technology, which is a seaborne technology, the longship, that gives them the ability to administer a level of shock and awe with their attacks, which are so quick, so unexpected, and are able to hit them where they aren't, that their opponents are completely flummoxed. They're really helpless against this constant drumbeat because you don't know where they're going to attack next. And by the time you raise enough troops and march down to the coast in order to defeat them, they're gone. They've already taken off. So that's the real challenge. It isn't so much that the Vikings were so violent, warlike compared to the other peoples at the time. It's that their shock and awe tactics took everybody aback and gave them this incredible advantage that it took a long time for their opponents in the rest of Europe, including the Anglo-Saxons, to really adjust and to be able to take the defensive measures they needed to really protect and secure their borders.
I think that answered one of my questions, or one of the things that I was thinking is that it necessarily wasn't that they had some sort of specialized training or that maybe the Anglo-Saxons didn't have. It's that they were able to employ a certain technology
That's right.
to maximize their strength.
It is, and it's a huge advantage. So even though the Vikings were, as I point out, even though they were really part-time warriors, I mean, if you're a king or a chieftain, yes, you've got sort of your band of henchmen, right? The house carls, as they're called, who are professional warriors, who are there to serve you unto death. But by and large, if you're going Viking with 4 or 5 longships, and that's about all you would need with an average expedition, 4 or 5 warships, maybe 30 warriors, riding along in each. Those who are traveling with you are not super warriors. They're not professionally trained. They know how to fight. They know how to use their weapons, a sword and the broad axe, and they know how to fight an enemy face to face. But they're part timers. It's ultimately going Viking is an amateur's game. It seems strange to say so because they were so skilled at it and so able. But in the end, it's men, and as we also know, women who are farmers and fishermen, and herdsmen and women, first and foremost, craftsmen, first and foremost, but who indulge in this activity in order to get the things that their, less than satisfactory economy can't provide them.
Speaking of women, and in this era, there's a lot of big names. Who are some of the larger than life characters who went Viking that we know about?
Well, it's really hard to distinguish the ones who are real people from those who are sort of shrouded in myth and legend by the Norse sagas, which is one of our main sources. There's plenty of sources outside of the Scandinavia, but they tend to paint the Vikings in the worst possible light, and they don't particularly care about what their names are. They could care less about that. They're simply describing what they see as inhuman brutes and savages, rampaging their way around the landscape. But I suppose probably one of the most famous names that we associate with the Viking age, and it lives on in television series, for example, is Ragnar Lodbrok, Ragnar with the hairy breeches, as he's called, who probably was an actual Viking warrior from the 8th century, and who probably did engaged in some Viking expeditions, probably none as large or as prominent as the Norse sagas present them as leading. And I would say probably the other 2 names that would stand out with an audience like ours and for this discussion, for whom going Viking involved even more than your sort of average marauding expedition, would probably be Eric the Red, who is the Viking, the Norse Viking who sets out traveling westward from the Faroe Islands, and eventually makes his way from there to the budding Norwegian colony on Iceland, to Greenland, and establishes a Norse colony there. And then his son, Leif Erikson, who's the one who leads probably the most famous transatlantic expedition of all the Vikings, the one to North America, and the one which, again, we know about from the Norse sagas, but which were kind of considered to be semi-fictitious, certainly not supported by any kind of firm historical evidence until the 1960s, when a pair of Norwegian archaeologists discovered the remains of a Viking boat landing on the coast of Newfoundland at Lance au Mido, which really established once and for all that there had been some kind of Viking settlement in North America, some sort of Viking settlement, which was more than just simply a stopping off place, but that involved real inhabitants and involved a presence on the North American continent 400 years before Christopher Columbus even thinks about sailing west.
There's so much to talk about, and I feel like a kid in a candy shop. I have to pick one thing, and one of the things that really fascinates me is the Vikings in Southern Europe because
Yes.
they're there, but I think they aren't always the first group you think of. But one of the things is when the Vikings and there's different groups go into southern or went into Southern Europe in the 900s, this is a time that this is the high watermark of Islam in the southern and the Arab conquest. They're actually in the boot of Italy. They've conquered Sicily. And how much was that that the armies of Islam had reached their high water point and it was time for them to recede? Or did these Viking groups, the Normans and the groups with the Byzantines, did they really start to kickstart that movement of the Europeans taking back some of these lands?
Well, I think both are true. I think there's a degree to which you saw a receding of the kind of large scale Arab activities, especially in the Western and Central Mediterranean, beginning in the 10th century and then on into the 11th century. And then you saw an enormous push by Western Europeans into that same region, one prompted by the movement we call the Crusades. But as I describe in the book, the Viking or Norman incursions into that same area predate the Crusades. These were, again, expeditions in search of loot, in search of adventure, and also at the same time trade. And these are, as I describe in the book, in talking about the Normans as descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France in the province known as Normandy, was the land of the Norsemen, hence the term Normandy, who you had the same problem in Normandy that you had in Scandinavia, and that is too many younger sons, not enough land to go around for a large family. And so Norman kinship groups and families would send their younger son off in search of, go find your own fortune. And that's precisely what happens with the sons of these Norman families. The most famous being the d'Hauteville family and the series of brothers who head for southern Italy, beginning in the 1020s, 1040s, and began their careers first as mercenaries, serving either Christian or Arab princes, doesn't matter to them, as long as the pay is, but then eventually become princelings and local powers by their own right. And I suppose the most famous of them is the great Robert Guiscard, Robert the Fox, as he's sometimes called, although, as I point out in the book, probably a better name for him is Robert the Weasel, who is one of the d'Hauteville brothers. He's the kind of fellow who would flourish in the Godfather movies. I mean, he's a totally unscrupulous adventurer, but good soldier, and someone who knows how to command the loyalty of troops and of followers, including other Normans. And in due course, he carves out an empire for himself in southern Italy, his brother Roger in the island of Sicily, and they become together probably some of the most powerful rulers in Europe. At the same time as their counterpart back home in Normandy, the Duke of Normandy, William, who becomes William the Conqueror. And as I describe in the chapter on the Norman conquest, we have to see that as yet another extension of that Scandinavian impulse for venturing forth, finding new lands, creating new opportunities for wealth.
Sort of the underlying theme is the kind of the internals of the Scandinavians, but so many of these Scandinavians, like the Normans, they really kind of lost their identity, or at least their top level cultural identity, really quickly. Do you see evidence that they maybe kept an underlying Scandinavian identity to them?
Well, that's a very interesting point, and I don't know if it's difficult to resolve that. I would say what you said about the top level is correct. First of all, they give up on their paganism, they become thoroughly Christians, and even allies of the Catholic Church. Something that would never have occurred to their Viking forebears. Right? The churches, the Catholic Church and monasteries are opportunities for booty, and loot. It's not something that you would, tolerate or even support or give money to. You take money out from places and they lose their nautical skill. When William, the seafaring aspect of Viking life fades away for the Normans once they settle in France. And as I point out in that chapter on the leading up to the Norman conquest, the Battle of Hastings, when Duke William has to assemble a fleet to carry his army across the English Channel, he basically has to work from scratch. He has to hire ships from people who know how to do this kind of a thing, including the Danes, including the Scandinavians, because the Normans themselves have simply lost all of that kind of shipbuilding skill and nautical know-how that went with their ancestors. On the other hand, you have to say that kind of clannishness of the Scandinavian and the Viking identity, that urge to adventure and taking a risk. Let's go see what's on the other side of the horizon. Boy, the Normans have that to the full. Very different from their other French neighbors. They adopt their language, the French language. They adopt the customs and laws of their French neighbors and the King of France. But that constant urge to push out, to look for new lands to conquer, new places in which to trade and build a new life for yourself. That's part of the whole Norman. That's part of the whole Norman modus operandi. And you have to say, where did that come from? Where does that come from? You have to say it's part of that ongoing Viking.
I think that feeds into the next part of that. In an area that I'm always interested is the religious history. And over the course of so many centuries before the Vikings, new groups of barbarians, for the lack of a better word, when they wanted to plug into Mediterranean culture, be it the Romans or the post-Roman cultures, Christianity was one of the things that they adopted to kind of plug into that culture. And it seems like in a lot of respects that the Scandinavians and the Vikings held off or resisted that urge quite longer than a lot of other groups did.
I think that's true. They remain aloof from those mainstream values for a very long time, and remain very proud of their ancestral ways, even of their pagan religion, and they remain proud of that. This is the curious thing: they remain proud of that even after they do convert to Christianity. The writers of the Norse sagas, for example, are all Christian. They're living in 13th century Iceland at the time, writing about a world which was still very much alive in terms of basic values and culture in 13th century Iceland. But they're really writing about events and characters and wars that are 2 centuries earlier in many cases. And they write about they give these splendid accounts of the pagan mythology, which they've left behind for hundreds of years. But they remain proud of it. They remain proud of that world and the values that animated it, including the myths and the legends about their gods and their heroes. And I think that's one of the things that's also very striking. And a contrast with the Germanic tribes, as you were just saying, who immediately sensed as they arrived on the frontiers of Rome and descended into Roman imperial lands, realized that they were significantly underdeveloped in terms of culture and economics, and were looking for any kinds of ways in which to plug in. And turning to Christianity became a key way in which to do it. What is one of the Gothic Goth says to his Roman contemporaries? He says, every Goth wants to be a Roman. He said, only a very poor Roman would want to be a Goth. Vikings don't feel that way. That's it. They take that. They have a great pride in the way in which they have built a culture and a life for themselves in this incredibly harsh environment. That they have these enormous skills which make them masters of the battlefield and masters of the seas, and they take that very, very serious. And so the coming of Christianity takes a long time. It's a long, ongoing process, as I describe it in the book. And yet it does bring significant change to the world of the Vikings and ultimately to Scandinavia. It really is the watershed that separates out the world of the Vikings. I would say even the world of the Normans I would say separates the world of the Vikings from what comes afterwards. And I include the world of the Normans too. They were Christians and they had respect for the Catholic Church, respect for Catholic values, didn't stop them from killing people at any opportunity that presented itself. But that was characteristic of the Middle Ages. That's the story of the Middle Ages, and not just for the Normans. But it does make a difference, the coming of Christianity, in terms of bringing new values, the value of compassion, which is not part of the Viking world, including compassion for others. It brings a new respect for the individual. It brings a new respect for questions such as the issue of slavery. You know, as I point out in the book, it's one of the things that people don't like to talk about the Vikings. They were the great slavers of medieval Europe. They were the middlemen by which the richer civilizations and cultures got the human beings they needed to do their manual labor for them. Islam, Byzantium, the kingdoms in Spain and France and elsewhere. The Vikings provided the slaves coming out of Eastern Europe from the Slavic tribes there, and also from the English and from the Celts, where they could catch them and take them. But with the coming of Christianity comes, first of all, a move towards you can't enslave fellow Christians. That's not going to be allowed anymore. And then the gradual disappearance of slavery itself within Scandinavia. A lot of the Viking economy depended on slave labor. It's hard to find a lot of willing hands willing to work through winters like that in those kinds of brutal conditions. But the disappearance of slavery comes a lot earlier than it does in other parts of medieval Europe, Stephen. And part of it is, I think, the impact of Christian values there, which tend to be taken rather more, should I say, are become more embedded in Scandinavian culture, partly as a result of the longer term that it took for the transition from paganism to Christianity. It's a fascinating topic and subject. I try to spend, I think, some useful time in the book talking about it. It's a very complex issue.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, it really is complex, especially since it really, in the grand scheme of things, they were one of the last groups to really fully adopt Christianity.
They were.
And then less than 4 centuries later, they're one of the earliest adopters of the Protestant Revolution, the Luther Revolution. Do you think that it was something that was inherent in their character and the way that they had practiced Christianity, that they went to this new form of Christianity that was spreading through Europe so quickly in the process?
Well, it is interesting, and it's done in ways that I think what you do find out is that the Catholic Church, as such, as an institution, because it came so late to the game in terms of the cultural and social landscape, political landscape of Scandinavia, never really established much more than very shallow roots there. And so what you see with the Lutheran Reformation is 2 things. One is you see a very quick transition from basically appropriating church lands and severing the connections with Rome, distant Rome, without creating a great deal of upheaval or great popular resistance to that movement. As you get in England, for example, with the English Reformation, there's always a strong undercurrent of pro-Catholic feeling, which takes a long time to eradicate. Doesn't happen really. And the other thing is, I think there was something about the Lutheran Reformation that, and Luther's message, in its simplicity, in its appeal to the idea of the priesthood of all believers, of the value of the individual in evaluating and understanding the religious message that Christianity contained, that really resonated with Scandinavians. It was part of that respect for the individual, respect for the degree of autonomy for individual men and women, that Lutheranism brought that I think had a connection with the way in which post-Viking medieval Scandinavian culture had been evolving anyway. It's interesting that Lutheranism is embraced by all four communities: Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland, and becomes the bedrock for religious teaching and education and the organization of social life from the 16th century right down to the very close to present day. As churchgoers, Swedes and Norwegians today don't tend to be much with the practice of going to church, but those values, that kind of Christian values, we would say, the belief of the power of individual conscience, compassion for others, for a belief in the golden rule, I think are still deeply embedded in Scandinavian culture. And I think we have to put that credit to the impact of the Lutheran Reformation in shaping the modern Scandinavian culture and character.
We talked a little bit earlier, and I think a good way to wrap up today is that in this early time, the Scandinavians, they didn't, even though they settled and colonized many areas, they didn't really make the impact like other colonizers did, who they forced their religion, their culture, and their language on the other people. And why do you think it is that the Scandinavians and the Vikings went to so many different places, but like we were talking about, that overarching culture they didn't push that onto the people that they more or less conquered?
Yeah, they're not empire builders as such. I think that's the best way to put it, including on each other. And this is one of the other things I point out in the Viking Heart is that however much we think about Scandinavian as sort of culturally homogenous, that Swedes and Danes and Norwegians and Finns and Icelanders share much more characteristics among each other, right? In ways that make them really distinct as a community. But that political unity in Scandinavia was never really achieved. I mean, there are those who tried, and for a very brief time, at the very end of the 14th century, there was an attempt to create a union of the three crowns, but it didn't last. The efforts to pull together a unified Scandinavia, compare that with the efforts to create a unified Great Britain. It happens, right? It's achieved. It comes together, and people have enormous difficulty trying to pull it apart, even today. But in the case of Scandinavia, the separate communities go their separate ways. But where they go to the outside, where they travel to the outside, they tend to be quick to adopt the ways and the language and to become part of the society in which they find themselves settled. Have become accustomed to here. And of course, that's the case with America too. They assimilate very quickly without abandoning their links to the old country. I mean, that's where we really started our discussion. This extraordinary sense of a link, the ties that bind, that link you back to the homeland in Norway or in Sweden or Denmark. Those ties don't dissolve. In many cases, they only seem to grow tighter and more valued over as time goes on here. When I think about my own family, and that being the case of how that Scandinavian legacy is able to carry through from generation to the generation, you have to say it's one of the most extraordinary stories, I think, in modern history, and the Scandinavian immigration to America. But you can't separate it from one of the most extraordinary stories in all of history, in global history, which is the incredible epic that is the Viking Age, of exploration, of conquest, but also of building the bonds that become the future of globalization, but also of extraordinary people with an extraordinary cultural skill set, which they use to build power all out of proportion to their size of the population or resources of their kingdom, but which they leave to their offspring. Scandinavians are always hitting above their weight, you could say. And it starts with the Vikings, and one could argue it remains the case today with Scandinavians and Americans here and with their kinfolk back in the old country as well. But that maybe is a discussion for another day.
Yeah. One last question that I have that if you'll indulge me is the Vikings are so often portrayed in the popular culture in movies and film and even cartoons. Is there any portrayal that you find particularly that you think is particularly fair, or maybe one that's really gets under your skin?
Well, it's always interesting, isn't it? The television shows and the movies and in the comic books and all the other representations of it. The one thing you have to say for them, they seem to be endlessly feasting. I mean, it's like one reveling party after another, and you sort of think, don't you think there were times when the Vikings just sort of said, boiled a couple of eggs and then went early to bed? I mean, I think that probably happened. Well, actually, it did. Of course. What the movies highlight are extraordinary episodes in the lives of ordinary Scandinavians of that time and place here. I think maybe of all of the movies, or I should say, I'll rule out the movies, I would say of all of the books that probably give a realistic look at them, I would recommend going to the Norse sagas. If you read the sagas, like, for example, Egil's saga, the book I was mentioning before, which I talk about in the Viking Heart, they're not only the most readable literature that come out of the Middle Ages, really approachable for modern readers in many ways, but they give you a picture of the human experience in living in the Viking Age, which is very different from the one which we get from the movies or TV series and all the other kinds of cultural stereotypes that we built up about Viking. You come to realize, yeah, sure, in the spring they do engage in some pretty rough stuff, as my grandmother would say. But at the same time, they live lives like the rest of us. They have families like the rest of us. They face moral dilemmas like the rest of us, have to make choices, sometimes the wrong choices, sometimes disastrously. But through the Norse saga, I believe you find the human face of the Vikings in ways that I can only recommend to your listeners here. I would say that after buying and reading my book, the next best thing for understanding the Vikings as they really were, and to see them and understand them as they really lived, is by going back to the accounts and the stories that the great saga writers and poets put together for it's an extraordinary body of literature, Stephen, and one which I think in terms of our understanding of both of literature, but also of understanding of the Viking Age, we're still just beginning to explore.
Thank you again for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. A huge thanks goes out to Dr. Arthur Herman. Links to learn more about New York Times bestselling author Arthur Herman and his latest book, Viking Heart, How Scandinavians Conquered the World, can be found in the show notes, and how to buy it and everything else. I highly suggest it. Great book. And another great thing is a great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. If you would like to reach out to me, you can connect with me and others who want to learn more about the movies they watch and great stories that very well could easily be movies on Facebook and Twitter by just searching for A to Z History. And like I've said, we may even be on other social media platforms. If you search A to Z History, you'll likely find them. You can always connect to me there, or just send a good old-fashioned email to steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all of this and more can be found in the show notes or at my website, a2zhistorypage.com. I will see you next time, Beyond the Big Screen.